I counted 4 men on my property before I even had my boots laced. Flashlights. Stakes driven into the ground at intervals too even to be casual. A tripod I recognized from a survey crew, not a construction one. Nobody had called me, nobody had asked. I crossed the grass barefoot the last few steps, cold mud packing into my soles, and grabbed the nearest one by the sleeve before he could pull his equipment back into the truck. "Who authorized this?" He didn't answer. He looked past me, toward my neighbor's porch light, like he was waiting for permission to speak that wasn't mine to give. That's when my neighbor said the sentence that changed everything. "You still don't know, do you?" I'd owned that lot for 6 years. Everyone on the block called it dead weight. A joke. The place weeds went to retire. Nobody had ever once told me what was underneath it. That was about to change. The lot sat 2 doors down from my house. Technically mine, practically nobody's. 6 years and I'd done nothing with it but mow it twice a summer and pay the taxes nobody wanted to remind me about. I told myself I'd build on it eventually. Everyone else told themselves it was a punchline. "You gonna finally sell that eyesore?" was how most conversations about it started, usually from a neighbor who'd lived on the street twice as long as I had and treated the lot like it belonged to the block's collective embarrassment. I never noticed the thing that should have bothered me until the summer we had 6 weeks without rain. Every yard on the street browned out. Grass gone the color of manila folders, sprinklers running on restriction schedules nobody could keep straight. Except mine. The lot stayed green in a way that didn't track with the weather, green in a way that looked almost stubborn, like the ground underneath had decided the drought didn't apply to it. I mentioned it once at a cookout, half joking, and got shrugged off. "Runoff," my neighbor said. Too fast, too settled, like he'd already had the answer sitting in his mouth before I finished the sentence. I let it go. People say things fast when they've said them before. What I didn't let go of, what I didn't even clock as strange until much later, was catching him out there. Not at the lot's edge, chatting over a fence the way neighbors do. Walking the perimeter, alone. Early enough that the sun hadn't fully committed to the sky yet, late enough that it wasn't a walk anybody takes on their way to anywhere. He wasn't looking at the grass. He was looking at the ground the way you look at something you're keeping an eye on. His pace was too even, too deliberate, the walk of a man counting something rather than clearing his head. I stood at my window with a coffee going cold in my hand and told myself I was reading too much into it. A man can walk wherever he wants at 6 in the morning. It's a free country, and it was, technically, still a free lot. But after the rain finally broke that drought, I walked out there myself, and I caught something in the air I couldn't place. Not grass, not wet dirt exactly. Something faintly mineral, almost metallic, rising up off ground that had no business smelling like that. I stood there longer than I meant to, breathing it in, trying to figure out what it reminded me of. Nothing about the smell matched anything else on that block. Not the fertilizer smell of the yards around it, not the chlorine drift from somebody's pool 2 houses down. I didn't have an answer yet, but I had a question now. And once you have the question, you can't unask it. I inherited the lot from my uncle, who inherited it from nobody in particular. He'd just bought it back in the 70s when land out here was cheap enough that people picked up extra parcels the way you'd pick up a second lottery ticket, more out of habit than plan. He never built on it, never really talked about it, not even when I asked directly at a family dinner once, half curious, half bored. He'd just wave a hand and change the subject, and I'd let him, the way you let older relatives keep their small mysteries. When he passed and the paperwork landed on my desk, I figured I'd do something with it eventually. A workshop, a rental, something. Eventually turned into 6 years of nothing. Not because I didn't care. Because caring about an empty lot is a strange kind of caring. The kind that shows up as guilt more than ambition. I kept the chain-link gate latched, even though nothing worth stealing was behind it. And some nights the wind would catch it just right and rattle it like it was trying to remind me it existed. A small metallic complaint drifting through my open bedroom window. The neighborhood had opinions about that gate. About the whole lot, really. Dead weight, somebody called it once, and it stuck. Kids used it as a shortcut to the bus stop. Somebody's dog used it as a bathroom. It was the place property value conversations went to complain, "Well, at least I'm not next to the empty lot," was a sentence I heard secondhand more than once, usually followed by an apologetic laugh when the person remembered whose lot they meant. I laughed along. What else was there to do? It was easier to be in on the joke than to explain that some inheritances come with more emotional weight than financial sense, and that letting go of the one thing that still smelled like my uncle's cigars, if you stood close enough to the old fence post, felt like letting go of him twice. That was around the time my neighbor, the same one who'd said run off a little too fast, started making noise about buying it. "I'll take it off your hands," he said, the way you'd offer to take out someone's trash. "Save you the taxes, save you the headache. Nobody wants to build next to an empty lot forever, and you know it's not doing you any favors sitting there." The number he offered wasn't insulting exactly. It was just low enough to tell me he genuinely believed the lot was worth nothing, or wanted me to believe he believed that. I told him I'd think about it, which is what you say when you mean no but don't want the conversation to get complicated. He nodded like he expected that answer, like there was no rush, like he already knew he had time. It was my neighbor across the street, not the one with the lowball offer, the other one, the one who kept odd hours because of a job that had him up before dawn, who texted me at 2 a.m. with a single line, "You seeing this?" I wasn't. I was asleep. But I was awake fast enough after that. By the time I got to my window, headlights were sweeping slow across the lot, throwing long shadows off the fence posts, off the one dead tree my uncle had never gotten around to cutting down. 2 trucks, unmarked, engines idling low the way engines idle when somebody's trying not to draw attention and failing anyway, because a truck idling at 2 a.m. draws exactly the kind of attention it's trying to avoid. I threw on a jacket over what I'd slept in and walked over barefoot again, because apparently that was becoming a pattern. Nobody explained anything. By the time I reached the gate, the trucks were already pulling out, taillights shrinking down the street, and whoever had been out there had taken whatever they were doing with them. What they hadn't taken was the evidence. My neighbor with the odd hours met me at the fence, phone in hand, having already recorded 30 seconds of shaky footage that showed nothing conclusive except that something had absolutely been happening. "I heard drilling," he said, or not drilling exactly, something, mechanical, low, like a generator running something underground. I didn't say anything. I was already walking the perimeter, and about halfway across, my boot caught on something that shouldn't have been there. A patch of ground slightly darker than the rest, slightly sunken, like it had been disturbed and packed back down in a hurry. I crouched down and dug 2 inches with my bare hand before I found it. A narrow, cylindrical hole, plugged crudely with loose dirt, the kind of hole you get from a core sample. I'd seen enough construction sites in my life to recognize it even half buried in the dark. Someone had been testing my ground, without asking, in the middle of the night. I stood back up slower than I meant to, dirt still under my fingernails, and looked at the lot differently than I had in 6 years. Not as dead weight anymore, but as something somebody wanted badly enough to come take a piece of it while I was asleep. "Whatever this is," my neighbor said quietly, "it's not nothing." For the first time, I agreed with him completely. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, and I didn't wait long into the morning before I was standing at the county records office, waiting for the doors to unlock. I told the clerk I wanted everything on file for my own property. Simple enough request. She didn't even look up when she said it, just tapped a few keys and printed out a stack thinner than I expected for 6 years of ownership, plus whatever had come before it. I sat at a scratched laminate table and started reading, the paper brittle enough that it crackled every time I turned a page, and it didn't take long to notice the gap. There was a decade, almost exactly a decade, where nothing had been filed on the parcel at all. No permits, no assessments beyond the standard annual tax valuation, no inspections, nothing. For a piece of land that had apparently been interesting enough for someone to run unmarked trucks onto in the middle of the night, it had spent 10 straight years generating exactly 0 paperwork. That wasn't normal. Land that sits idle still generates some paper trail. Utility easement renewals, boundary confirmations, something. A full decade of silence read less like neglect and more like somebody had deliberately kept it quiet. I called my neighbor with the odd hours. I'd started thinking of him as an ally by that point, not just a guy across the street, and told him what I'd found. He'd done some digging of his own overnight, the kind of digging you do on your phone at 4 a.m. when you can't sleep either. "Those trucks," he said. I ran the plate off my video before it timed out. It traces back to a geological survey outfit, not a construction company, not a utility company, geological. That word sat heavier than I expected it to. Geological survey companies don't get hired to check on soil compaction for a fence line. They get hired when somebody suspects there's something underneath worth knowing about. Water, minerals, something with a value attached to it that isn't visible from the surface. I went back through the paperwork with that word in my head and found something I'd skimmed past the first time. A soil composition report, filed years back, buried in an addendum nobody would think to read unless they were looking for it. It didn't have my uncle's name on it. It didn't have my name on it. It had a company name I didn't recognize at all. Why would a survey company file paperwork on land they don't own? I asked, more to myself than to him. Maybe, my neighbor said slowly, they weren't planning on it staying that way. I looked at that unfamiliar company name for a long time before I said what we were both already thinking. Whatever was under that lot, somebody had known about it long before I ever caught headlights sweeping across the grass at 2 a.m. And somebody had been working very hard to make sure I never found out. The name on the soil report led nowhere on its own. A company that didn't show up in any registry I could find, no website, no listed address beyond a P.O. box 2 counties over. But names like that don't exist in a vacuum. Somebody has to file the paperwork to create a name like that, and paperwork leaves fingerprints. I brought what I had to a woman who worked the archive room at the county office, a records clerk I'd gotten friendly with over the years, mostly because I was one of the only people under 60 who ever asked her genuine questions instead of just demanding copies. She'd taken an interest in the mystery almost as fast as I had, the kind of interest that comes from doing a quiet job for a long time, and finally getting handed something that isn't quiet at all. She pulled old utility easement maps for the block, unrolling blueprint paper so dry it rasped like it might crack down the fold lines, and traced her finger along a line that ran directly under my lot. "There's an old easement here," she said. "Predates you, predates your uncle probably. Utility right-of-way, never fully documented which utility." That was the first theory that made sense to both of us. Some utility company, decades removed from whoever originally filed the right-of-way, wanted it reactivated. Old easements get forgotten, then rediscovered, then fought over, especially when new development in the area makes an old pipeline or line suddenly valuable again. It would explain the survey company. It would explain the secrecy. Utility companies don't love announcing their plans before they've locked down the legal footing. It didn't fully explain why my neighbor had been walking the perimeter alone at dawn like it was his to protect. But I told myself that could be coincidence, or nosiness, or just a man who liked to walk. Word got out fast after that, the way word always does on a street where everyone already had an opinion about the lot. By the following weekend, half the block had a theory of their own, most of them louder and less informed than mine. "Probably a gas line," one neighbor said with total confidence, despite having no information beyond second-hand gossip. "I heard it's the water company," said another, equally certain, equally wrong for reasons I didn't yet understand. The rumor mill turned my quiet mystery into a spectator sport, and every version of it added a little pressure I didn't ask for. People stopping by unannounced, asking questions, offering opinions on what I should do with land that 3 weeks earlier, none of them had cared about at all. I let the easement theory sit in my head because it fit, because it was tidy, because it gave the strange trucks and the strange silence a shape I could understand. I didn't know yet how wrong tidy would turn out to be. The easement theory lasted exactly 4 days. It fell apart the way theories usually do, not with one dramatic discovery, but with a small detail that refused to sit still. The records clerk called me on a Tuesday, her voice pitched a little higher than her usual archive room calm. "That shell company," she said, "the one on the soil report. I found the original filing." The folder she'd pulled had a cracked wax seal on it, the kind the county hadn't used in decades, which told her before she even opened it that whatever was inside predated the easement paperwork by years, long before any utility company would have had a reason to care about my block at all. "This doesn't fit your theory," she said. "The filing date is too early. Whoever set this up wasn't reacting to a utility need. They were planning something before there was anything here to plan around." That same afternoon, my neighbor's name came up in a way I hadn't expected. I'd asked around, carefully, about who might know something about the old company name, and a guy 2 streets over, someone who did title work for a living, semi-retired now, squinted at the name I showed him and said, "That's odd. I want to say I've seen that filed alongside a name I know. Can't place it, though. I didn't push. I didn't need to, not yet. Because 2 days later, standing at my own mailbox, I watched my neighbor publicly deny any involvement in the surveying to another neighbor within earshot of me. Flat, casual, convincing. "Wasn't me," he said. "No idea what's going on over there. Probably kids messing around or somebody surveying the wrong address." It would have worked, too, if I hadn't already been holding a printout in my other hand with a name buried 3 lines down in a filing from decades ago. A name that matched his a little too closely to be a coincidence. I didn't say anything to him. Not yet. I filed the moment away instead, the way you file away a card you're not ready to play. When I finally went back to the county office to request the original reclassification file connected to the shell company, the response wasn't paperwork. It was a pause. A too long pause, followed by a clerk telling me the file was under review and unavailable for release. An answer I'd never once gotten for a request on land everyone insisted was worthless. Worthless land doesn't get files pulled from public access. Worthless land doesn't get anyone nervous enough to reach for a phrase like "under review" on the spot. I walked out of that building with more questions than I'd walked in with, and for the first time, one of them had a name attached to it. If the county wasn't going to hand over answers, I needed someone who remembered the lot from before it became a punchline. My neighbor with the odd hours, the one who'd texted me at 2 a.m. and hadn't stopped digging since, tracked down a retired surveyor who'd worked our block back in the 70s, not long after my uncle first bought the parcel. He was in his 80s now, sharp in the way people get when they've spent a career noticing details other people walk past, the kind of sharpness that outlasts the body it's carried in. We met him at the Archive Annex, a building so rarely visited that our footsteps echoed hollow off the tile the entire walk to the reading room, like the place itself wasn't used to having anyone in it. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds in a rhythm none of us bothered to comment on. He remembered the lot the second I described its location. "That one," he said, nodding slowly, tapping the table twice like he was confirming it to himself as much as to us. There was a clause on it, odd one. Nobody ever explained it to me either, and I was the one who filed the map. He walked us through what he could recall, a designation that had once flagged the parcel under a protected resource classification, the kind of thing typically reserved for land sitting on something the county wanted preserved or controlled, not developed. Water tables, in his experience, were the most common reason. Sometimes mineral deposits. He couldn't say for certain which applied to us, only that the flag had existed, and that flags like that didn't get attached to land for no reason. And then, he said, one day it didn't, quietly unflagged. No public notice, no hearing that I remember. Just gone from the records like somebody erased a line and hoped nobody would ask why. I asked him who would have had the authority to do that. He shrugged, older knees creaking as he leaned back in his chair. Somebody with a reason and somebody willing to sign it. That's usually all it takes. Paper only protects you as long as somebody's watching it. Stop watching, and paper's just paper. My ally asked if he still had any of his old field notes from that period, anything that might show who'd requested the original flag, or who'd been present when it disappeared. The surveyor thought about it for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. "I might," he said finally. "Boxes in my garage I haven't opened since my wife passed. Give me a few days." We left with more than we came in with, a term now, protected resource zone, and a decade-old erasure that lined up almost exactly with the gap I'd already found in my own paperwork. Whatever was buried under my lot hadn't just been discovered recently. It had been discovered a long time ago, quietly protected, and then quietly unprotected by someone who understood exactly what they were giving up when they made that call, and exactly who might benefit from it. The confirmation came from the ground itself. I'd asked a contractor I trusted, someone who owed me a favor and didn't ask too many questions, to run a simple ground-penetrating scan on the lot, off the books, before anyone else's trucks showed up uninvited again. He found what the core sample holes had already hinted at, a large void beneath the surface, structured, not natural. Something built, not something geological in the random sense. We found the hairline crack first, a thin seam in the soil that let out a breath of cool, damp air when I knelt down close enough to feel it against my face. Air that had clearly been sealed somewhere it shouldn't have been able to reach the surface. Air that smelled faintly of stone rather than dirt. What the scan mapped out wasn't a cave or a pocket. It was a cistern. Old, large, and deliberately built, the kind of underground reservoir towns used before modern municipal water systems existed. Stone-lined, engineered, older than every house on the street combined. Older, the contractor guessed, than the street itself. The records clerk confirmed the rest within a day, cross-referencing what the surveyor had told us with historic water rights filings buried even further back than the shell company paperwork. The cistern wasn't just old infrastructure, it was tied to a water right, a legal claim to a water source that predated the town's current municipal system entirely, one of the rare pieces of land in the county still carrying that kind of standing. Nobody currently used the municipal system's alternative sources for anything critical. On paper, that made the old water right sound like a historical footnote, the kind of thing that gets mentioned once in an appendix and never again. Except somebody clearly didn't think it was a footnote. Somebody had gone through a great deal of trouble across more than a decade to make sure nobody else thought so either. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the scan printout in front of me, running my thumb along the outline of something that had been sitting under my feet since before I was born, and finally understood the shape of what I was dealing with. This was never just dirt. It never had been. It had never even been close to dirt. It was leverage. And somebody had spent years making sure I didn't know I was holding it. I brought the retired surveyor back in once we had the cistern confirmed, mostly to ask if the water right could really still hold up legally after all these decades. He answered a different question instead. "You want to know if this was an accident," he said, pouring himself a glass of water from an old thermos he'd brought, water that carried a faint metallic taste I noticed only because I was already thinking about everything underground. It wasn't. He'd done some remembering of his own since our last conversation. The kind of remembering that comes back slower with age, but comes back true, helped along by 2 boxes he'd finally pulled down from his garage rafters. He recalled, now with more confidence, that the unflagging of the protected zone hadn't happened through a routine county process. It had happened through a specific request, one he'd only seen referenced once, buried in an old planning committee note he still, improbably, had a photocopy of, yellowed and curling at the corners. The name on that note was my neighbor's family name, not his, a relative, 1 generation back, sitting on the same committee that had quietly stripped my lot of its protection. I felt something shift when he said it, cold and metallic, not unlike the mineral taste that had lingered on my tongue the day I first caught that strange smell rising off the grass. "Your neighbor's family didn't discover this recently," the surveyor said, setting the photocopy down carefully, like it was something that might tear if handled wrong. "They've known, in some form, for a very long time. Somebody just made sure the knowledge stayed in the family and out of the public record." It explained everything I hadn't wanted to line up yet. The runoff comment that came too fast, the perimeter walks at dawn, the lowball offer dressed up as a favor, even the flat, rehearsed way he'd denied it at the mailbox. None of it had been curiosity. It had all been maintenance. Quiet, patient maintenance of a secret that had outlived the man who first buried it in paperwork. The worthless lot narrative the whole block had accepted without question, the joke, the eyesore, the dead weight, hadn't formed by accident either. It had been built, deliberately, repeated often enough, by the right person, for long enough, that nobody, including me, ever thought to question it. I looked at that lot through my kitchen window that night and saw it differently than I ever had in 6 years of ownership. Not dead weight, a secret somebody had been sitting on, waiting for the right moment to finally take it off my hands. Knowing it wasn't an accident answered 1 question and opened 5 more. If my neighbor's family had known for decades, why move now? Water rights that go unused for that long don't suddenly become urgent on their own. Something else had to be driving the timing. Some reason the old, quiet arrangement wasn't quiet enough anymore. Some deadline pressing against a plan that had otherwise been content to sit still for a generation. My ally with the odd hours found it, working late one night in the after-hours glow of the county planning office, where a friend of his had let him in to use the public terminal, the fluorescent hum overhead the only sound in an otherwise empty building, punctuated occasionally by the tick of the HVAC cycling on and off. A regional development permit, pending. Large-scale, multi-lot, the kind of project that reshapes a stretch of road for a generation. And buried in the feasibility requirements, a single line about securing an independent water source to support the development's projected demand. A requirement the existing municipal system, according to the filing, couldn't fully guarantee on its own without significant infrastructure upgrades the developer clearly wasn't eager to fund. An independent water source, the kind an old, forgotten cistern with a still valid historic water right could provide, if someone controlled the land sitting on top of it. My lot wasn't a coincidence sitting in the path of some unrelated project. It was the linchpin, the one piece nobody else could substitute, the one parcel standing between a permit application and approval. I sat with that for a long while, turning it over the way you turn over something too big to hold comfortably in one hand. "That's why the offer wasn't insulting," I said finally, mostly to myself. It was never about buying deadweight cheap. It was about buying the one thing they couldn't build without, before I ever found out I was holding it. My ally didn't disagree. He just asked the question that mattered more than any answer we'd found so far. "So what happens if you don't sell?" I didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since this all started, I realized the question wasn't really about me anymore. It was about how far somebody was willing to go to make sure I never got the chance to ask it out loud. The confirmation came from a source I hadn't expected, someone who worked administrative support for the development firm behind the permit application, a distant acquaintance of my allies who'd grown uneasy enough about what she was seeing internally to quietly forward a document neither of us had asked her for. It landed in my inbox smelling somehow, even through a screen, like the sharp scent of fresh toner, a leaked internal planning memo, printed and scanned in a hurry, the edges of the pages slightly crooked in the scan, like whoever copied it had been watching the door while they did it. The memo laid it out in language far more direct than anything I'd pieced together myself. The development's water contingency plan named my parcel specifically, by lot number, as the preferred acquisition target for securing the independent source required by the permit. Preferred, the memo noted, because it could likely be acquired below market valuation given current perception of the property. Current perception. Words chosen by someone who understood exactly how that perception had been shaped, and by whom, and who saw no need to hide that understanding in an internal document nobody outside the firm was ever supposed to read. My neighbor's name appeared 3 lines down, listed as a long-standing informal advisor to the project, not an employee, not officially connected on paper in any way that would raise questions, just close enough to have influence and far enough to have deniability. It didn't take much more to see the shape of the whole thing. Devalue the lot publicly, patiently, for years. Let a nickname like dead weight do the heavy lifting a formal offer never could. Wait for the right moment, a development timeline with a hard deadline, and make a lowball offer that would look, to everyone including me, like a neighborly favor rather than the final move in a plan more than a decade in the making. I thought about the number he'd offered, calm and unhurried, like there was no rush. There hadn't been, until there suddenly was. I sat with the memo open on my screen for a long time, feeling less angry than I expected and more clear-headed than I had in weeks. Every strange detail finally had an owner. The trucks, the silence, the perimeter walks, the offer that wasn't quite an insult, even the smell rising off the grass after that first rain, which I now understood was probably nothing more mysterious than moisture finding its way down to stone that had been sealed underground for decades, exhaling upward the one time conditions let it. None of it had been random. All of it had been waiting for me not to notice. I thought the memo was the end of the digging. It turned out to be the middle. A closed-door HOA session got called that same week, officially about unrelated landscaping business, though I noticed the agenda had been rewritten twice in 3 days according to the version history the HOA secretary let slip when I asked. I sat near the back, folding chair creaking under me every time I shifted, and listened to a board member I'd known casually for years steer the conversation toward unverified rumors about my lot with a little too much practiced calm. It was my ally with the odd hours who put it together afterward, cross-referencing board membership against public filings none of us had thought to check before. That board member held a minor but real financial stake in the same development firm behind the permit, nothing large enough to require public disclosure under the HOA's outdated conflict of interest rules, but more than enough to explain why unverified rumors needed managing before they spread any further. That was the second name. The third came from somewhere closer to where this had all started. The records clerk, going back through the original reclassification file one more time, found the name of the county official who had approved the original unflagging decades earlier, a retired official, still alive, still occasionally consulted informally on planning matters in the area. The same official's signature turned up again, much more recently, on an early procedural document tied to the current development permit, decades apart but unmistakably the same hand. None of these connections were illegal on their own. That was the part that unsettled me most. No single signature, no single stake, no single closed-door meeting broke any rule by itself. It was only when you laid them side by side, the way we now had them laid across my kitchen table, that the shape of something coordinated became impossible to ignore. The worthless lot story hadn't just been maintained by one neighbor with a convenient family history. It had been quietly reinforced by people the whole community had been trained to trust without question. The board that ran their HOA, the office that kept their county records straight, the retired official whose old signature still carried weight nobody thought to double-check. I looked around that folding chair meeting room differently by the time it ended. Not everyone in it was involved, but enough of them were that I finally understood why nobody had ever handed me a straight answer, not once, in 6 years. We laid it all out on my kitchen table on a Sunday night, papers fanned under a single lamp because it felt right to do it somewhere plain and unremarkable, the same way the truth itself had been sitting somewhere plain and unremarkable for over a decade. My ally with the odd hours built the timeline on a legal pad, start to finish. The original protected zone designation from the 70s, the quiet unflagging a decade later tied to a name on a planning committee note, the shell company's early filing, the decade of engineered silence in the public record, the runoff comment, the perimeter walks, the lowball offer, the leaked memo, the board member's stake, the official's recycled signature. The records clerk brought the piece that made it airtight, the original protected zone document itself, still on file, never formally rescinded through any process that would hold up to scrutiny. Unflagged in practice, perhaps, through quiet influence and a convenient decade of silence, but never legally undone. Which meant, as far as the law was concerned, the protection had arguably never actually gone away. Someone had just made very sure nobody looked closely enough to notice. The retired surveyor agreed, without hesitation, to put what he remembered on the record, sliding his old photocopies across the table like he'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask. At his age, he said, he had very little left to lose, and very little patience left for watching a mistake he'd witnessed decades ago quietly repeat itself on someone else's doorstep. I looked at the table full of paper. 6 years of a joke everyone told about a lot everyone assumed was empty, stripped down now to a straight, unbroken line running from a 70s committee meeting to a leaked memo sitting in my inbox. "This isn't a rumor anymore," my ally said quietly. It wasn't. It was a record. And records, unlike reputations, don't erode just because somebody spent a decade hoping nobody would read them. I had one decision left to make, and for the first time since headlights swept across my lot at 2 a.m., I didn't feel uncertain about what came next. I gave him the chance in private first. Not because he'd earned it, but because I wanted to be able to say, later, that I had. He came over expecting to talk about the offer again, expecting the same conversation we'd been circling for weeks. I laid the folder on the table instead and let him read it himself. The committee note with his family name, the shell filing, the leaked memo, his own name 3 lines down as an informal advisor with a great deal of formal deniability. He read slower than I expected. When he finally looked up, there wasn't shock on his face, just calculation. The same calculation I imagine had been running behind his eyes for years every time he'd said the word runoff a little too fast. "You don't understand what you're about to do," he said. I told him I understood exactly what I was about to do, and asked if he wanted to explain his side before I did it.